Well, Vladimir, it's great to have you back in the studio in the same chair where I remember you March the 29th, 2022. And I vividly remember the conversation we had when I was asking you about what you're going to go, where you're going next, and you're off to Moscow. And I said, but, they'll arrest you. And you said, yes, they will, probably. And I said, and they'll throw you into jail on some trumped-up charge. And you said, yes, Andrew, they probably will. And I said, and they'll throw away the key, and God knows what's going to happen next. And you said, no, that's right. And I said, why the heck are you going back? And you said, because I'm a Russian politician, and I can't be these days anywhere except Russia. But it was a terrible... I mean, you knew what you were going into then, didn't you? You knew what was going to await you when you touched down in Moscow.
Well, Andrew, first of all, it's really good to be back in your studio, and I really mean this when I say it. Absolutely, I've felt my whole life that a politician, those people who aspire to be politicians, have a responsibility that frankly transcends any considerations of personal safety or personal comfort. How could I call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up and resist the Putin dictatorship if I wasn't prepared to do it myself? That just wouldn't work. I mean, that would just be hypocritical, to say the least, and unethical. And this is especially true at a time of crisis, at a time of repression, at a time of war, because the way the Putin regime rules our country is primarily through fear and repression. All this sort of talk of high popularity of Putin and so on, this is all complete baloney. This regime has kept itself in power for almost a quarter century now through fear and repression. But as the Soviet dissidents have shown us back in the day, fear is also a choice. Yes, the state, the regime rules by trying to make everybody afraid, but at the end of the day, it's up to each individual person to decide whether or not he or she chooses to be afraid. And I think it is incumbent on those of us who are the public faces of the opposition in Russia to not be afraid and to show others that they shouldn't be either.
Well, we remember very well Solzhenitsyn and Bukovsky and Sakharov and the others. But can I ask you, when you landed in Moscow back in April 2022, what actually happened to you? You were arrested for disobeying the police originally, is that right?
No, well, first of all, when I landed, I went home. They only arrested me about 6 days after I returned. And I was driving back home that day. This was the 11th of April, 2022. And I noticed a surveillance car behind me. Well, that's no surprise. If you're a Russian opposition politician, surveillance is a daily occurrence, so we almost, stopped paying attention. But then when I approached my apartment building, I saw some kind of a silver minivan with darkened windows standing next to the entrance. But again, I live in central Moscow. There's always cars around, so that wasn't too surprising either. But as I stopped to open the gate into the courtyard to park my car and started driving inside, I looked in my rearview mirror and I saw about 5 or 6 police officers coming out from the minivan, their faces covered in black balaclava masks, and they started running behind my car. And this was when I understood what was happening, and I had time to park my car and text my lawyer that I've been arrested. And that moment, the commanding officer opened my door.
And you were taken straight to prison at that point?
Well, I was first taken to a police station, then to court. I mean, it was a whole process. In the 2 years and 3 months that I've been in prison, I went through 13 different institutions. As my wife says, I've been given an extended guided tour of Putin's gulag to see it from different angles and different places. And then the indictments kept sort of coming one after another, right? So initially, it was a charge of spreading so-called false information about the Russian military, which means in Putin speak, that means telling the truth about the war in Ukraine. Then there came another charge of cooperating with a so-called undesirable organization. This was a conference that I co-organized at the Sakharov Center in Moscow on political repression and political prisoners in Russia. And then finally came the biggest charge, so-called high treason, which consisted in my public speeches.
So, high treason, and you were given a 25-year prison sentence?
Yes, this was the highest sentence for a political prisoner in Russia since the death of Stalin, since 1953. It hasn't happened since. And my 5 counts of indictment that ended up being in my sentence were 5 public speeches that I'd given, 2 against the war in Ukraine, 2 against political repression and political assassinations in Russia, and 1 against the illegality, the illegitimacy of Putin overturning the constitutional term limits to stay in power, essentially indefinitely. And I remember on the day of the sentencing at Moscow City Court, this was in April of last year, in April of 2023, as I was being escorted down from the courtroom into this sort of basement area of Moscow City Court where there are cells to hold prisoners, the commanding officer of the police convoy turned to me and asked, "Did you just really get 25 years in prison for 5 public speeches?" And I said to him, "Yes, I guess I did." And he said to me, he looked to me again and he said, "Well, at least I hope they were good." I said, "Well, that's probably for the judge to respond, and I suppose there must have been if that was the sentence." But it is the reality of Russia today under Vladimir Putin that people get longer prison sentences for peacefully voicing their political opinions than others get for murder, for rape, for drug trafficking. We have the record number of political prisoners in the modern history of Russia today. There are more political prisoners in Russia today than there were in the whole of the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s towards the later period. And of course, the fastest growing category on the Russian political prisoner list are those Russians who are publicly speaking out against Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine.
And you ended up in what we still call the Gulag. You were in prison in Siberia. What was it like?
I was kept in solitary confinement at a maximum security prison in western Siberia in the city of Omsk. That's a city, by the way, that has long traditions going back literally centuries of holding political prisoners, both in the imperial
Goes
times,
back to the Tsars.
in Soviet times, absolutely. And, some of the Decembrists were there. Dostoevsky, of course, was at the prison in Omsk, and his Letters from the House of the Dead. That novel was written based on his experiences at the Omsk prison. In the 20th century, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whom you have mentioned, was at the Omsk prison on his way to the Gulag
It's
camp.
almost an honor.
Well, you could absolutely say it is, and what's also really astonishing is how little has changed, even the smallest details from what it was before. I mean, while I was in prison, I was reading or rereading many books, memoirs by Soviet dissidents, and everything down to the smallest details is just exactly the same as it was.
Tell us more. What was it actually like? What were the circumstances?
Well, I was kept in a small cell about 2 meters by 3, 4 walls, a small window under the ceiling with metal bars. The bunk bed gets attached to the wall at 5 o'clock in the morning with a wake-up call, and then you can only take it down again at 9 p.m. with the lights out. So for the whole day, you either just walk around in a small circle in a cell, or you can try to sit at this really tiny, uncomfortable stool that sticks out of the wall, but you can't really sit on it for long. You have no one to speak to. You have nothing to do. You have nowhere to go. You only get a pen and paper to write for an hour and a half a day, then it gets taken away again. I was not allowed to call my family in the 2.5 years that I was in prison. I only once was able to speak to my wife on the phone, and only twice to our 3 children. The last time was in December, just before Christmas. It was a 15-minute call. We have 3 kids, so my wife was literally standing there and measuring with a stopwatch to see that each kid does not get more than 5 minutes on the phone with their father. Look, this is an old Soviet tradition where the regime seeks to punish not only the political enemies themselves, but their families too. This is what they've been doing since communist times, and this is what they continue to do today.
It's unimaginable. It would break me within about 2 or 3 days, I think.
Well, first of all, you do not know that. You don't know that unless you've been in a situation, so don't say that. You never know.
You never know. And so you're in this circumstance for a very, very long time, this tiny little room, and there comes a point when you think that you're going to be taken out to be executed.
All right, this was on July the 28th, but before that, a few days before that, came this really bizarre episode when I was taken from my cell by 2 prison officials, escorted to some sort of a prison office where there was a desk, a chair, a big portrait of Vladimir Putin on the wall, and on the desk there was a sheet of paper with a pen and some sort of a pre-printed template next to it. And they told me to sit down and write with my own hand what was written in the template, and I looked at it, and it was a request for pardon addressed to Vladimir Putin, in which I was supposed to admit my guilt of all the crimes that I had committed, express my remorse, and ask Mr. Putin to pardon me. When I saw it first, I thought this was a prank. So I just laughed at these prison officials, but they didn't seem to be in the mood for joking. You know, Russian prison officials rarely are. And I asked them, what is this? And they said, oh, please write and sign this. I said, I'm never going to, write anything like this. They said, why not? I answered, well, first, because I do not consider Vladimir Putin to be a lawful president. I consider him to be a usurper, a dictator, and a murderer. And second, because, I'm not going to admit any guilt because I'm not the one guilty of anything. The real criminals are those people in the Kremlin who are leading this war in Ukraine, not those of us who are in prisons because we oppose it.
Given every opportunity to punch Vladimir Putin on the nose, you take it.
Well, I believe that we have to speak the truth. Otherwise, what's the point of being in politics? The prison officials were visibly not amused, so the officer asked me if I'd be prepared to put that in writing, which I said, this I'll be very happy to write, so I wrote all that down. Added that I very much hope to live to see the day when Vladimir Putin will be sitting in a dock on trial for all the crimes he had committed. I signed it, dated it, and gave it to the prison officials. And that was it. They escorted me back to the cell. It was a really bizarre episode, came out of nowhere, this sort of request for a pardon. And then came the night that you're asking about. This was Sunday, the 28th of July. I was suddenly woken up in the middle of my sleep by a group of prison officials who barged into my cell. It was dark outside. I asked what time it was because you're not allowed a watch or a clock on the cell. It's supposed to be sort of disoriented, but I could see it was dark outside the window. So I asked them what time it was. They said 3 a.m. And they told me to get up, get dressed, and get ready in 10 minutes. And yes, at this moment, I was certain that I was going to be let out and be executed. But instead of the nearby woods, as it were, where this would have been done, they took me to the airport, handcuffed under a police escort, boarded me on a plane and flew me to Moscow. It took 3 hours. The return journey was much quicker because last year when I was transferred from Moscow to Siberia, it took 3 weeks in the Stolypin carriages through all the transit prisons.
Just explain to me what a Stolypin carriage is.
Oh, these are sort of the old train cars used to transport prisoners in the Soviet Union, right? And it's actually a bit of a misnomer, the Stolypin carriages, because, of course, Pyotr Stolypin was prime minister in the imperial times. And the reason they're called that is because in the early 20th century, there were settlers who were going to Siberia sort of on train carriages, but the big difference is they were going there voluntarily. There were no prisoners being exiled. Whereas these prisoner trains that we have now, basically they originated in Soviet times and they haven't really changed. But the return journey was only 3 hours by plane, and needless to say, they do not usually transport prisoners in Russia on a plane, so something was really strange there. In Moscow, I was taken to Lefortovo, which is the notorious...
That was the KGB prison in Moscow originally.
Absolutely, the notorious NKVD, KGB, FSB prison that once held the likes of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Vladimir Bukovsky and Natan Sharansky and other celebrated opponents of the Kremlin regime. And there I was held for a few days, and I have to say, I know that's going to probably come out sounding bizarre, but I really enjoyed that time there because it was like a 5-star hotel after my prison in Siberia. Because first I had a bed, which I did in Omsk. As I mentioned, the bunk bed gets attached to the wall, and that's it. Secondly, I could write all I want. I had my notepads, paper and pen, not just for an hour and a half a day, but however long. There's a strict limit on the books in Omsk. I was only allowed 1 book if it's a punishment cell, or 2 books if it's a regular isolation cell. In Lefortovo, I could have all the books I wanted. So it was. I had a really good time there. But because everything comes in comparison, right? The only thing that was disconcerting was I could not understand what I was doing there because nobody explained anything. And so by this stage, my thinking was that it must be some sort of a new criminal case because that's usually the reason. They bring somebody who is already a prisoner into Lefortovo. Except, of course, I struggled to think why they would need to open a new criminal case against somebody who had already received a 25-year sentence, which you cannot survive anyway. But, that sort of the system, the machine of repression that Putin has built, doesn't always work according to normal human logic. It has its own sort of internal dynamic of repression. So, it passed day after day, and then came the 1st of August, which was the day of the exchange, as we know now.
And again, it's guys with balaclavas pulled over their face, not something you want to come across, who lead you to the plane that will take you eventually to Turkey, and the crossover, the handover. Some of Putin's people in the West were being passed back to Russia, and in return you and other political prisoners were being released into the West. And this was Biden to Putin really created this, as I understand it.
And Scholz. These were 2 Western governments.
Olaf Scholz.
U.S. President Joe Biden and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And the most powerful message sent by the US and German governments with this exchange was to insist that it included not only their own citizens held hostage by the Putin regime in Russian prisons, but also Russian prisoners of conscience, Russian political prisoners. The last time there was an exchange of this kind that liberated a Russian political prisoner took place in October of 1986, before the Reykjavik summit, when Reagan said that he basically won't go and meet with Gorbachev unless the Soviet government release Yuri Orlov, a very prominent physicist, founding chairman of the Moscow-Helsinki group. And that was the last exchange involving a Russian political prisoner. There hasn't been anything like this in almost 4 decades. And this was a really powerful message of solidarity on the part of Western countries with all those people in Russia who opposed the Putin regime and who opposed the war. And it was also a very clear signal of recognition on a part of the West that they know very well that the real criminals are those people in the Kremlin who have started this war, not those of us who are in prison because we had opposed it.
And at this point, you get a phone, and you are called by President Biden, and he has with him your family.
So that was the longest day of my life, the 1st of August 2024. It started in the morning when the deputy director of the Leforovo prison came into my cell with a few prison guards. They brought my bags from storage. And he told me to take off my prison uniform and put on whatever civilian clothes that I had. And the only civilian clothes that I had was my black T-shirt in which I slept, my long johns, because in Omsk it was minus 40 in the winter, so you have to put something underneath when you go outside, and the rubber flip-flops that I used to go into the prison shower. So I put it on, he looks at me and he says, "Don't you have any normal civilian clothes?" And I said to him, "Look, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, I'm serving a 25-year sentence in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison in Siberia. Why would I need civilian clothes?" He had nothing to respond to that. He just said, "Okay." Then I was escorted down. And yes, there was a row of men, again, their faces covered in black balaclavas, but plain clothes this time, no uniform. This was the infamous Alpha Group, the FSB special unit. The same unit, by the way, that transported Vladimir Bukovsky for his exchange in December of 1976. So, as I said, nothing changes in Russia, even down to the minutest details. And there was some kind of a bus standing in the prison courtyard, which I was told to go up in it. And when I did, I saw that in that bus there were more men in black balaclavas, so more FSB officers. But next to each of them, I saw a friend or a colleague or a fellow political prisoner who had been serving, time in prisons all over Russia. And it was at that moment, and at that moment only, when I understood what was happening here, because there could only be one reason why all of us would be on the same bus together. Then, yes, a very quick whirlwind ride to the airport. It was a government airport of Vnukovo 2, used for official delegations. They put us up on a Tupolev 204, a government plane, and flew us to Ankara, the capital of Turkey. As I was sitting on that plane, I couldn't help but remember the words of Bukovsky after his exchange in 1976, when he wrote in his book To Build a Castle that we have a really funny country where they can neither arrest you nor release you according to the law. Because the way we were released completely violated all the legal procedures. Well, first of all, I refused to write a request for pardon to Mr. Putin. He still pardoned me, I guess, forcibly, illegally. Secondly, perhaps most importantly, Article 61 of the Russian Constitution expressly prohibits the expulsion of a Russian citizen from Russia without his or her consent. Nobody asked our consent at any point in time. And third, I do not even have a passport because my Russian passport expired while I was in prison last year, and they didn't bother making new ones. So anyway, we arrive in Ankara. The actual exchange takes place on the tarmac in some sort of a military zone in the airport that was cordoned off by military and police. And then we were taken by bus to some sort of a government terminal building, a big reception room, long table with tea, coffee, sandwiches, cookies. And, things just couldn't get more surreal. I was still, wearing my T-shirt and long johns and rubber flip-flops, and, just to underscore just how surreal that day was. That same evening, I'll be meeting with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, wearing that same T-shirt, long johns and rubber flip-flops. And at that moment, so we're all standing in this reception area, and a lady walks up to me in a business suit and holding a mobile phone. And she asks me, "Are you Mr. Kara-Murza?" I said, "Yes, I am." and she hands me the phone and says, I'm a diplomat with the American Embassy in Ankara. The President of the United States is waiting to speak to you. And at that moment, I just thought, I'm just going to give up trying to understand what is happening here. I took the phone. I heard President Biden's voice. I sort of tried to put something together to say to him. Of course, I hadn't used the word of English in 2.5 years. I hadn't used much Russian either because I was sitting in solitary confinement. But I spoke to him. I thanked him for what had happened. And then he passed the phone to my wife and children who were with him in the Oval Office. And as I'd mentioned, Andrew, I was not allowed to call my family when I was in prison. And so, when I heard their voices on the phone, I don't think I'll be able to find words in any of the languages that I know to be able to express how that felt.
What an extraordinary story. Vladimir, can I ask you one thing? Can you please not go back again?
I have absolutely no doubt that I will return to my homeland. Russia is my home. It always will be. And when our plane was taking off from Vnukovo Airport on the day of the exchange, the FSB convoy officer, the Alpha Group officer who was sitting next to me, turned to me and said, "Look out into the window. This is the last time you're seeing your homeland." And I looked at him with, just couldn't help laughing. And I said, "Look, I'm a historian by education. I not only think, I not only believe, I know that I'm going to be back home in Russia. And it's going to be much sooner than you can ever imagine."
That's a wonderful thought. Of course, President Biden is on the way out. We have a new president, Donald Trump, coming in.
Chancellor Scholz is on the way out, it seems like as well.
Scholz is on the way out too, probably. And we don't know what's going to happen with the Ukraine war. But things are going militarily better for Russia at the moment. What's your assessment of where we are now and the danger that Ukraine is in?
Well, first of all, let us not forget the original goals that Vladimir Putin had when he launched that war, the full-scale war in February of 2022. He wanted to take Kiev in 5 days, and he wanted to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign, independent nation. Very obviously, none of these goals have been accomplished. And so, in a very important sense, Putin and his regime have failed in their original objectives. Of course, his propaganda...
Failed so far. We don't know what will happen next.
Well, I don't think...
If the Americans don't back Ukraine...
There's a lot of talk now. Of course, I don't have any inside information on this, but there's a lot of talk that the new U.S. administration will be looking to negotiate some sort of a settlement. And of course, we're yet to see what that could look like. But there are two things that I would say are very important in whatever negotiations, whatever settlement we're talking about. First, it has to be a deal that takes into account the interests of Ukraine and that is acceptable to Ukraine. It cannot be a humiliating ultimatum for Ukraine. Vladimir Putin cannot be allowed to emerge triumphant from this aggressive and criminal war. Because if he is, that means there will soon be something else. Because we know what the appeasement of dictators leads to. It has led us to this. We also know it from the history of the 1930s.
But do you think Trump understands that?
Again, I have no inside information about what the next administration will do. What we do know about President-elect Trump is that he's very unpredictable. We've seen the announcements of some of his future cabinet lineup. And Senator Marco Rubio, who has been chosen as next Secretary of State, is somebody with a long track record of having a very strong and principled position on issues relating to democracy, to international security. I've known him personally for many, many years. But the second thing that is really, really important when we're talking about any deal to end the war in Ukraine is that it has to include a provision about freeing, not only about exchanging, obviously, all the POWs and returning all Ukrainian POWs and Ukrainian civilian hostages, of whom there are thousands in Russian prisons. They have to be returned home. That goes without saying. But it's also very important that any such deal includes a provision about freeing Russian political prisoners, especially those who are imprisoned because they had opposed this war. Their fate cannot be forgotten in any such negotiations, in any such agreement.
That's very important. Do you feel that you are now safe, or do you think you're a marked man as far as Putin goes?
Well, look, when our plane was landing in Ankara on the day of the exchange, one of our FSB convoy officers turned to Ilya Yashin, another Russian opposition politician, and to me, and said with a smile, "Don't you think, guys, that you'll be safe over there? Krasikov can come for you too." Krasikov was the FSB hitman who was serving time in Germany, who was exchanged for us on that exchange, because Putin really wanted him back. Of course, they didn't mean the Krasikov. They meant any of them. Small K Krasikov. Sure, I mean, they have a lot of these people, as you know very well, in this country. Look, safe is not a word that belongs to the vocabulary of a Russian opposition politician. We all know that what can happen both inside and outside the country. What's important, though, is that, I know that what I'm doing is the right thing, and I'm going to continue doing it regardless. But what's even more important than that, and goes sort of way beyond the personal aspect, even if Putin gets rid of all of us, all the people who are sort of the current faces of the Russian opposition, all it means is that others will come to take our place, somebody from the new generation. Russia will be a democracy. I'm a historian by education. This is the direction of history. The future does not belong to one-man personalistic dictatorships like the Putin dictatorship. The future belongs to democracy, and Russia is not going to be an exception to this. And, no one has ever yet been able to stop the course of history, and Vladimir Putin is not going to be the exception.
Vladimir, we've had a lot of extraordinary people through this studio in the last few years. I've never done an interview like this. I'm incredibly privileged to talk to you. Thank you so much, and the very, very best wishes for whatever comes.
It's a pleasure to be in your studio again. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.